James 2, verse 24. You see that a person is justified by what he does and not by faith alone.
Whenever you quote that verse to a corrupt, lawless so-called Christian, they're going to come back at you with one of three things. And this is part one of a three-part series in which I address each one of those three things. Number one, they're going to say, well, that's talking about being justified before men and not before God. And then they're going to rip out of context Romans chapter 4 to try to prove that. But there are three pieces of evidence that prove that theory wrong. Number one, in context, if you read the entire chapter, you will see that James is talking about being justified before God. He even went as far as to say that faith without works is dead, useless. And may I interject that dead faith cannot get you an inch toward heaven. And then he pulled out scriptures about Abraham to prove it. It's what Abraham did that made him justified. And that's clearly talking about being justified before God, because that's the same passage that Paul uses to justify his faith alone doctrine. So obviously, if James is talking about being justified before men, then so is Paul when he preaches the faith alone doctrine. Because they base their doctrine on the same scripture, but they come to the opposite conclusion. Number two, there's no way that James would be teaching you to be concerned about what men think. That's called the fear of man. And the Bible speaks against the fear of man from beginning to end. And number three, church history shows us very clearly that James was talking about being justified before God. The evidence is clear, from Marcion in the 2nd century all the way to Martin Luther in the 16th century. They knew very well what James said, and they knew very well what James meant. That is why they rejected the book of James. They liked Paul much better, and they knew that James was preaching against Paul. In fact, Martin Luther, the leader of the Protestant Reformation, the father of the Protestants, said that the epistle of James is straw. Burn it. Yes, those historical church leaders knew very well what James said and what he meant. But they didn't have the incentive to try to justify James. They didn't worship the Bible canon like a lot of people do today. A lot of so-called Christians today are idolaters. Their idol is their 66-book Bible canon. And they'll do theological gymnastics. They'll twist and turn and bend over backwards to get every one of those books to be compatible with the other. And that's the truth.